And there we go, we're live now. All right, everyone, welcome to week 2 of our election coverage. I'm your host, Stuart, and I'm joined today by centrists Aussie and Drew to discuss the first 2 weeks of the election campaign. And what a 2 weeks it's been so far. It's already a third of the way in, but we have so much stuff already happening. If you want to start off, Drew, by talking about, I guess, the first day of the campaign, which is Albo's big stuff up.
Well, it was an interesting start, wasn't it, for Albo? The first official day of the campaign, I believe the first official press conference of the campaign, and it went pretty horribly wrong. So we wrote up a piece on the Oz Liberty website discussing this, and it was one of those moments where you kind of like, duh, are you really this bad at politics? Because he couldn't even answer the unemployment rate. It was an incredible moment, really quite telling, that you're running for prime minister of the country and you don't know the current employment rate. He was also asked the federal cash rate or the reserve cash rate. I don't even know what that is, right? So I was kind of like, what is that? It's not the inflation rate. It's not the reserve interest. It's not the interest rate. It's some other banking metric that's in the system. But he couldn't answer that question either. I think the worst part about it, though, guys, was he tried to pretend that he did, and then eventually stumbled into admitting he didn't.
Yeah.
And so there was this moment of him just going, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm full of shit," basically. And it was an incredible, incredible way to start the campaign. Really couldn't be any worse. So that was Albo's first day. Check it out on the Australian Liberty Network website for the full write-up. But couldn't be worse for Albo, really.
Before we started, you were saying, centrist, this is really his election to lose. And he's already stuffed up several times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that this will play out like Shorten did? Sorry, go. You go.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. Is that I think that Albo, it is Labor's election to lose. I don't think, but they're doing their best to try and lose it. I don't think that the LNP are going to get back in, but I guess it depends now on how bad Albo goes with what he does. I think he pretty much had to do the Biden technique, which is go and hide, now that he's got COVID as well. So hopefully he's not too sick. Let's put that out there. But yeah, I think it's probably the best thing that could happen for him because he doesn't have to say anything then, and then keep his mouth shut. So yeah, like Shorten, somehow managed to lose an unlosable election just because they talk too much and show everyone what a politician is really like.
I think the other major thing that happened during the week that I saw, and I try to avoid as much as this is possible, but he made an appearance at an arts festival or a music festival. I believe it was Blues Fest or something like that. Did we see this, guys? Do you all see it?
Yeah.
And
I did. It was hilarious.
It would seem the reaction from the crowd was mixed at best, right?
Yeah.
And it makes sense. Given, I think it was Byron Bay was the location, and up in those trees and in that wilderness, beautiful countryside of Australia, we find quite a bit of a spiritual, free-loving artist community up there. Yeah, exactly. That's the word I'm trying not to say, Bruce. But these guys love kind of, their natural medicines and their individual creativity and freedom of expression and all these things. So there was always going to be some resistance to the medical authoritarianism that came through in the last couple of years. So, and we know that Labor is completely on board with that stuff. So Albo copped a bit of a spray up in the, what you would normally expect to be his loving, receptive crowd in those artist communities. So that was interesting to watch. I don't know if that was Wednesday or Thursday, but it was, kind of midweek that happened. And that took everybody by surprise. Again, we were expecting quite a receptive, normally it's to be a receptive audience for a Labor candidate. So quite surprising to see, really.
Yeah, it goes into that. Into that. That's all right. Yeah, it goes into that. It's been an interesting ride seeing like you said, the typically left wing, described left wing hippie culture, which is like you explained, be labelled right wing because all of a sudden being anti-vax is right wing, and so it's really, like you said, it's really interesting seeing this sort of move of the so-called libertarian left to be like very anti even the left-wing politicians that go up there. So it's just an interesting development to watch happen over the last few years.
It kind of illustrates that the normal alignments of politics aren't really where they used to be. There's now these splinter groups within leftism that care about individual medical independence and these sort of things. Yeah, and those votes, I don't think, can no longer be counted on by their traditional homes, which makes for an interesting election. What did you make of it, Stu?
Yeah, really, the exact same thing. It is going to make for a very interesting election. I agree.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite moments from the election so far has been Adam Bandt coming to Queensland. I had to have a bit of a laugh at that one. Came up to Queensland, said that, he spoke to all these Queenslanders who complain about being called conservative state, because even though we have a Labor government at the state level, we usually vote Liberal federally. It's because of how the districts are drawn up. And he said that he spoke to Queenslanders who are upset about being called the conservative state. And then he said, we're going to focus on inner Brisbane seats in the election. And I'm like, no wonder people are complaining about being conservative state, because you're talking to the southeast corner. It's like a 2-hour radius for travel: Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast. And the Gold Coast is actually in the middle because they're pretty liberal as well, as in capital L liberal. So the fact that he's just in that one area saying that these people don't like being called a conservative state, when you've got almost all the other federal electorates in Queensland are blue liberal. It's just the disconnect from politicians, and again with Albo going to Blues Fest and getting heckled there. It's the exact same sort of thing. Politicians being disconnected from the people. What actually is the feelings of the voters.
Come on, mate. That's my Melbourne MP you're talking about, disparaging Adam Bandt, Melbourne's Greens, glorious Greens MP, the only Greens MP in the country federally, right? That's right, isn't it? He's the only.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it doesn't surprise me at all that he's completely disconnected and out of touch, and is focusing on the inner city. That's what they do, right? Is those inner city socialists are their bread and butter, and he's targeting. I think. Like that. Well, yeah, I know my partner's mum is up in Crow's Nest, which is north of Toowoomba, up in, a more regional part of Queensland, and she's a Greens voter going way back. So there's definitely people out there in the wilderness, but they're definitely a rare breed more than the common, more conservative type. But yeah, I think it's a good play for Greens. It makes sense. I'm not in any way condoning or endorsing them, but for them to focus on inner city Brisbane, I think they've got more chance there. And this is just my instincts, that they've got more chance in a seat like Brisbane than they do in Sydney, where there's so much sort of banking money and other forces at play in that city. It wouldn't surprise me if they were in the mix up there.
We do have two Greens at a state level now, South Brisbane and Malwa, I think, and they're neighbouring in a Brisbane seats. So there is, of course, that that support there for it. But again, it is in Brisbane. It's not exactly the whole state.
Yeah, it's a good strategy. I just wish there was a clear strategy for someone like the Lib Dems to make a play and open up the field for them in some way. There doesn't seem to be like any target, like the Greens have their targets and they have their strategy. And you would hope that at some point the Lib Dems can find those places, those pockets of resistance. Maybe it is Toowoomba. Come on, Bruce, we've got to get you up there, mate. What's going on?
No, I'll be doing my bit over here in WA. With the Lib Dems have a pretty strong showing in Western Australia, which is
right,
good, I suppose. But obviously WA is only so much of the vote. But I think a lot of it stems down to how New South Wales and, as you said, Queensland and Melbourne vote. So it'll be interesting to see how the Lib Dems do attack that. I think that in Melbourne, I think they've done the right thing running David Limbrick up there, moving from state to, I believe, is he running Senate or House of Reps? I can't remember. I'll have to check that.
Is he running?
Limbrick
He's running federally now.
Yeah, he's running federally. Yeah, so
wow,
that's.
okay.
I think that was a really good move on their part to bring him up because he's obviously well known enough in Melbourne. So. And then there's also the other minor parties got to keep it on with how they're moving and tracking as well. I think the One Nation is picking up a bit of steam this election. She seems to be, despite her history, seems to be hitting a lot of buttons with a lot of people. She's pushing. Yeah, seems to be gaining a lot of support. I think she's going to hit Queensland pretty well. And I think it's Queensland, isn't it? And you don't know, maybe she'll pick up some other votes in some other states, but I think, it's interesting though that she ran Christensen on the same Senate, running on the same Senate ballot in Queensland.
Lost you there, Bruce.
We've lost you.
I might just jump in while his connection restores. You getting me, Stu?
Sure. Yeah, getting you fine.
Yep. So while Bruce's connection restores, I just wanted to say, Pauline.
That's where did you
Pauline,
guys? Where to finish off?
You there? I think we can hear him. Anyway, Pauline Hanson made a bit of a prediction. She earlier predicted in the week that Albo would go into hibernation and maybe even catch COVID. And she did it in two ways. I think she called it on morning television. I saw a clip of that going around. But she also called it in the animation series that they have for One Nation's, political marketing campaign. Excuse me. In the previous week, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the episode of Pauline Hanson's animation series, she had Albanese hiding in a basement with Joe Biden. I don't know if you saw this episode, but it was quite hilarious. Albo basically went downstairs into the basement to hide, and down there was Joe Biden sort of in the fetal position in the corner, and Albo proceeded to ask Biden for advice on how to win the election, and he said do nothing, basically. Pauline Hanson seems to be quite predicting the future of Albo getting COVID and hiding.
So the question I have for you guys after the first 2 weeks of the campaign is that a concern I have is having three minor parties on the right, Lib Dems, UAP, One Nation, is that they could split the votes, and you run the risk then of if the votes going to Labor, or the electorate going to Labor, because it gets split between the three right-wing minor parties. Especially when you then add in like Qatar and North Queensland First and the SFFP and all those other smaller parties, do we run the risk of giving Labor the vote basically by splitting the right wing into so many different factions?
I think there is always that risk, isn't there, that they splinter off. Mind you, I remember a friend of mine at the last election blamed the United UAP for giving the election to the Libs, right? Because of the preference deal that, the preference deal, which I think again is that ignorance stemming into the debate, right? They think that these parties have the power to run the preferences in. Whether or not, I think it is a threat to the unity of the conservative base, for sure, because ultimately the preference deals will flow in different ways and will break up accordingly. And so, yeah, for me, I'm expecting a Labor victory because the right will fracture under the pressure of this authoritarianism.
We know that the left's always been more, because of their collectivists, they've always been better at unity in Australia. Labor predates federation, whereas Liberals and Nationals are pretty new creations, I guess. There's been a long line of factional splits and the like that led up to the Liberal and National parties. And I guess the Greens are the only real challenge to left-wing dominance in Australia. And we've seen that they tend to work together pretty well. Of course, you look at Julia Gillard's government, where the Greens MP in the House of Reps gave them supply and confidence, gave them the support to form government. So there is that alliance there between Labor and Greens. Not as strong as Liberals and Nationals, but still definitely something there.
Do you think that there's a chance we'll see a new coalition form, since we're talking about the fracturing of the three, the fracturing of the right, and also the gain? So Lib Dems obviously are gaining from the left and the right, but majority from the right. Do you think there's a chance that there could be a minor party coalition? Is that possible? Can we see a UAP, Lib Dem, One Nation, for example, become their own coalition?
It's a good question, actually. I know the Lib Dems are working with One Nation pretty well. I don't know how it's going to go between Lib Dems and the UAP, especially if Campbell Newman wins the Senate seat in Queensland, because he was Premier when we had... He was Queensland Premier when we had Clive Palmer in Parliament at a federal level. So I think that'll be very interesting to have those two together, and I don't know how they'll work together. Palmer, Palmer or the UAP and the Lib Dems, if that happens.
I think, Bruce, it's unlikely from purely a sociological perspective. I think those people in those parties tend to be fairly volatile, dynamic, and maybe a little eccentric even, right? So you'll see a lot of unique character types in those parties that there'll be friction ultimately, right? There's not that kind of characteristics in, say, the Greens or anything like that, but I think because they're liberty-minded and because they're individualistic-minded, I just can't see them coming together effectively as a force of nature. And that's we know this. Libertarians aren't very good at being together or being organized. It's kind of this dichotomy of what it is to be liberty-minded. You're not really good at collectively thinking. So I think one anomaly or one force of nature that kind of went against that grain was John Howard. I think John Howard is admired a lot for his ability to keep the Liberal Party under control and to kind of have a cohesive momentum with that party more than anything. That's my take on John Howard. He's kind of seen in this nostalgic way now. I see him as a bit of a war criminal and a monster, to be honest with you. But I think the one thing he did do was have that group under control, of a group of fairly individualistic thinkers under control. And so I think we can't expect that from the minor parties, because they're not even in They haven't even got seats yet. So there's still a lot of elbows out, and there's still a lot of attitude to come from. I would love to see several of them get up, because then there'll be fireworks in Parliament. It will be a bit of a debacle. I imagine there'll be a shit show play out if we get, 3 or 4. That would be amazing to see. We want to see it, right? And that's my hope. Yeah, that's my hope, is that we get some. I think I'm agreeing with Stu now that the best chances for this election is that we get some minor parties in, and they have the balance of power.
Because the problem's going to be, in that case, would be dislodging the Greens, who currently dominate the crossbench in the Senate with 9.
Yeah.
So none of the 76 senators are Greens, compared to 1 MP in the lower house. So it's very different. But I think the problem is going to be dislodging them, because they will get it. They're not going to support the Liberals. The Greens won't back the Liberals. And it's unlikely that they'll work with like the UAP and with One Nation. So I think that's going to be the big problem there, is getting rid of, and the Greens have made it clear. Adam Bent made it clear that he wants to get rid of Pauline Hanson from the Senate. From the Senate? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he wants to get rid of Pauline Hanson from the Senate for Queensland. So it's very obvious that the Greens won't work with those right-wing minors, with the possible exception of Lib Dems, but definitely not One Nation and UAP.
Having Adam Bant as your enemy is great marketing, I imagine, for Pauline Hanson. Like, in terms of political strategy, put him on your poster.
So I guess we are seeing the populist UAP stealing policies from other parties from the Greens. They were applauded by Adam Bant for wanting to get rid of student debt. You want to talk about that for a second, centrist? Because I know you're passionate about that, and I am as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think sometimes we try to recreate the wheel. I think in Australia, our system, like, you could argue about whether the merits, how high your grades need to be to get in, can be adjusted and all that. But our loan system for the HECS debt is actually really, really good. It gives you the best of both worlds. It offers you a loan that is interest free, so you're not going to go bankrupt if you don't come out of your degree with the exact job you come from. You don't pay it back until you're earning, I think it's over 40K a year. So it gives you time to grow into a role if you need to, so you can start paying your HECS off. And it also then guarantees that people can get into uni, for those who may not be able to afford to go straight out and pay for uni. I think it's a system that works really well. It balances out whether we it's not like in America where they can go bankrupt for not paying the debts off, and they've got an interest rates, and that also, when you have those sort of interest rates and loans and stuff, the cost of the degrees keep going up because it's all a big money making scheme. Whereas this way, our system, I think, is really good. I don't think we need to pay off student debt. If you've got student debt, you should be able to pay it off yourself. And that's from someone who's been through the system as well. I had to pay off my debt. I think the system, like I said, the system's set up really well to keep a good, even balance between what we have. But then there's people who say maybe it should be free, but I don't know. I kind of like the system we have.
I think it's horrible policy by Clive Palmer, probably instigated from the top, by Clive Palmer, who is, he's of the populist mold. He's clearly trying to appeal to a populist left ideal, which is free shit. But I think it's awful. I tend to agree with centrist here that the HECS system is pretty good, with a caveat. I do think with that government money in the system, we tend to get a lot of rubbish education that wouldn't be paid for out of your own pocket. I tend to think, all that kind of critical theory stuff that we see, especially in the American universities, but I'm sure it's filtering in to the universities in Australia. We tend to see that being pursued by students who don't have to pay for it and parents that don't have to pay for it, right? So, but I think we need the HEC system. I think it's an important thing that enables social mobility in this country, and I wouldn't want to disband it. But yeah, this is horrible policy. You know, I think Michael Malice in the US put it well when he talked about the idea of you're basically asking the trucker in Kansas to pay for the barista or the student, the gender theory student, or the student in New York to pursue a career, a high paid career. You know, that's unacceptable kind of transfer of wealth there. When you put that on the back of that trucker, you ask and you give that person in New York a higher income as a result. What kind of policy is that? So I would hate to see anything like that become a reality in Australia.
I think what we could add to the current system that might help is actually open up industries to traineeships and apprenticeships that aren't typically in line with that. So you can get people who have to do a certain degree and then fluffing it up with other subjects to get through, when they could just go and do it on the job training, which I think it's a balance between the two. But if you can do a traineeship and work for a company that's going to train you up in the systems that's needed, you can do this with all things. You can do this with lab technicians. You can do this with there's a lot of the sciences that you can get into and do it that way. And I think it's a better way of learning in terms of hands-on. And then maybe you supplement some of the courses through that system, and then they only have to do a few courses, and then that saves money for the taxpayer as well. So whilst also producing for the economy.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the trend over the last I don't know how long, hundreds of years, where we've outsourced mentorship from the private sector into education, and we lose that sociological aspect of the welder teaching the trainee, in the workplace and on the job. Those sort of sociological things that we've lost over time, I think, are just as important to me and to many. And so, I think we should be expecting more from private rather than farming it into education where we can charge kids for it. It's extortion. We're extorting money out of the young people for things that normally would have been given to them in the private sector. But, unions doing what they do, right? They said you can't pay them a trainee wage, you can't pay them a smaller wage. We got to have these standardized wages, and then that just it cuts off the entry point. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, I think as the anarchist, we all know where I stand on this. Definitely not happy with it. Having been in the system right now, and seeing the fact that because we already have the HECSTAD system, which means that it's available for a lot more people to go in than it would be usually, because it's basically free, because HECS is an interest-free loan, or it's at least freer than the US system is. It means that you've got a lot of demand for courses, and the result of that demand then is that they have to then increase the threshold to get in. So, for example, when I went through the high school system, where in Queensland we had what's called the OP system. So you had to get an OP1 or an OP2. So that's like an ATAR 97, 99 to get into law in Brisbane and that area, Brisbane, Logan, Ipswich. You had to get an OP1 or an OP2 to get in. And the reason for that was just because there was such a high demand that they had to only take the top tiers. And what that means is they're only taking people from inner Brisbane schools, like Brisbane Boys Grammar and the like, taking only from these top tier schools, and you basically have elitism. It's like the Ivy League, for example, but in Australia, because it's free, you then have to increase the threshold, because you have to. There's going to be some way to respond to that demand, especially when the government controls the cost of degrees. So they can basically change it at will, because most of the universities we have are public universities, of course. So they can change that at will. And then what ends up happening is that even though it's meant to be free, or at least free loans of money, you end up having
I just want to correct that.
So all the student debt is then held by the wealthier, because they're the ones getting into the courses easily, compared to the rural students who, even though it's free, they still can't get in because of the market being flooded by demand.
I'll just push back. It's not free. I just want to clarify that you do have to pay it back. You don't get it's very hard to get away with not paying your HECS debt back. The interest-free part means that you don't have to be pushed into debt, like into further debt, in order to try and cover your education, which is big. It's a big difference, and I think it needs to be stated. So when people are saying it's free education, it's not really. The other thing, what did you touch on? I just blanked it now.
Elites.
Oh, the country, yeah. But the other thing is to remember that there are scholarships and stuff available for country students. So because one of the hard parts for those things with the uni, like you're talking about, it's not just like the inner suburbs, but the cost of living and stuff, and moving to the university, there are scholarships and things in place set up in order to help those students access the university. So it's not just the wealthy kids that are getting in.
Well, I mean wealthy in the sense that because of the high threshold you get in, that's what I'm talking about. It's because you then have that raised threshold, which makes it easier for people who, have been to those better quality. Because we know the Queensland government loves to spend money on Brisbane schools and Ipswich, Logan, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast schools, not so much in the rural communities. So they like to, spend all the money that they can on improving Brisbane schools, which means that those students then have, in theory, more opportunities to do better at school, in theory, better teachers and the like, and then they get into the universities easier than regional communities where they don't have those opportunities that the government gives to Brisbane schools.
So just to clarify, Stu, you would abolish HECS? Is that your take on it? Is that what you would do?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Now,
the problem with the US system is that it's the same thing with government intervention in the education system there. That's what led to the high interest rates and like, because again, government intervention in the education system. They've got the inverse of us. So they've got all the universities are basically private and all the high schools are basically public, whereas we've got a mixture of public and private high schools, and most of the universities are public. So it's different, but you still have government intervention in the education system over there, and that basically gives protection to the loan sharks, basically.
Yeah. So just to put your back against the wall, Stu, you're currently a university student. Have you put your money where your mouth is? Or did you take advantage of the loans on offer?
I used it. That's because we don't have the system set up. So whenever I can, I will try to avoid using government funding. So, not taking welfare payments, because I'm a student. So in theory, I could apply for government student welfare, but I refuse to do it because, again, principally anarchist as much as possible. So I work my way through it instead to pay for cost of living and the like. I do have HECS debt, but that's only because it's we don't have a good system set up yet for being a student, having student loans through the private sector. We don't really have a system set up for that. And whenever possible, I do try and minimize that student debt by paying it while I'm at uni rather than paying it later on. So I try to do the best I can, but in the system that we have.
There's definitely that perverting of the incentive, or the free market is definitely being, what is the word? Perverted, I guess is a way to put it. When there is a government system in play, then there is no incentive for a private sector to become involved and provide solutions to the problem, right? And so, I think Elon Musk tweeted out, it's crazy when a student can't get a $10,000 business loan, but they can get $100,000 student debt, right? That's some weird perverted incentive system in play that fucks with people ultimately.
Yeah,
and
it's because the government guarantees a loan.
Yeah, and I think that brings us round full circle, right? That I don't blame students for taking this choice. They're young. They're still developing minds, and for them to take it is not it's not really a casting any kind of aspersions on their character, but it's the system is taking advantage of them, really, is what's happening. And so when you've got people like Clive Palmer saying, we'll pay that back for you, of course they're going to be jumping up and down about that, right? They really have been targeted by this system, and kind of it's exploiting them and their youth and inexperience and all these things, and ultimately probably giving them a shitty education at the end of it too. So with this massive debt, it's a horrible situation, but making the trucker in Toowoomba pay for it I don't think it's the answer.
It's interesting that we've now, going into this election, if you'd asked us 6 months ago what the core issues of this election was going to be, everything was going to be about the mandates and the freedom, etc. And now we're sitting here talking about uni Hexter. So it's interesting development that suddenly, all of a sudden, all these things are popping up again when everyone was so set on what their principal voting was going to be. And then a party like UAP threw out they're going to pay off Hex debt, and everyone's just like, what? Oh. So.
Yeah, well, that's it. It's such a weird one. It's like, you're going to do what now?
And of course, the state premiers can. When people do take that COVID angle that we thought they were going to make selection, but they haven't so far much, the premiers can then say, well, we've dropped restrictions, so you can't call us tyrants because now we've dropped them. The benevolent government has dropped the restrictions. For example, the cap on how many people you can have in a room for events in Queensland drops right before Labor Day. At the start of next month. So all the state governments dropping the restrictions. New South Wales dropped their mandate. Victoria dropped their mandate. Queensland's dropped their mandate. All these walls are dropping, except in the Western Australia for some reason. So the state governments can then all the Labor governments can say, well, we gave you back the freedoms. You can't complain about it.
Call me cynical, but the timing is just really. It stinks more than anything. It's like you get to have a whole bunch of the community going, yay, we've got our freedoms back, and you kind of dissipate that energy that's suppressed under those mandates somewhat just before an election, and it stinks. But I thought I'd chime in a little bit about, the US. Obviously, we paid quite a bit of attention to it, and some people have made some valid points that someone like Ron DeSantis is better kept at a state level, more effective at a state level than moving up to a federal level, right? And, I think the same argument can be applied with someone like David Limbrick. I'm reticent to give him away at a state level to do what at a federal level. We kind of saw David Landholm struggle for many years at a federal level to get anything done. I think his grandest achievement was a shotgun or some kind of, it wasn't, he didn't get a lot through. And so, are we better off building state bases of liberty rather than federal? I think we are. And I think that's a strategy moving forward that we're going to have to come to terms with. I don't think we get it done at a federal level, to be honest with you. I think the New Hampshire Free State model is something that we should all be looking at as a way forward concentrate people in a place to be able to really change the game. But moving David to the federal level, I hope that game plays off. And we'll see, I guess, is what I'd say.
We'll have fun doing a state level based thing because the UAP wants to scrap states. The UAP just wants a federal government and councils, and that's it. Have fun doing a state based liberty movement if you don't have any states.
Under the Clive dictatorship.
Has he actually clarified all that? Because I know it was talked about, but I don't think it was ever fully clarified. I know the Lib Dems pushed back on it a little bit, but did he actually release a video or anything that clarifies?
I'm looking now.
On that? Because
it seems like
it was said
nuts.
Yeah, and I'm coming, and this is Drew. You're in Melbourne and I'm in WA, and even I'm sitting there going, no. Even though we've got we've got the two worst Labor premiers going around, but yeah, I don't want to see a federal government have overall I want to keep some power back to the states for sure.
Yep. So Clive Palmer and Craig Kelly on the UAP website have both called to abolish state governments. So that's official policy by them. To abolish states. God. So they want to get rid of states and centralize power in the federal government. They want to get rid of student debt. They've tried to ban 3D printed firearms in Queensland. They're not the most libertarian party out there, I'm sorry, but, all these policies.
They're clowns.
It's interesting seeing that stuff now. Yeah. It's the UAP, I've always said at the start, I was surprised when Kelly went to the UAP. I've always been a bit on because Clive Palmer's a magnate and he's lots of money and he's got ties with overseas. And yeah, just for me, it was a bit too opportunistic on his behalf in order to try and capitalize on some stuff, I think. But I could be wrong.
It's really sad because we saw Mark Latham. He had a dalliance with the Lib Dems as well. I think he was thinking about joining them before joining One Nation. We've seen Craig Kelly, I think, who was it recently? Was it last week or the week before? The former Liberal independent guy, help me out here, Stu, who's joined One Nation, I want to say. James Christensen.
George Christensen.
George Christensen. Yeah. He joined One Nation, right? Imagine if all those departures went to the Lib Dems and created a third force like we have in the UK. Liberal Democrats in the UK are a third force. Like they are.
Yeah, they're a bit of a joke right now. They're pretty small.
Yeah, and they're also not very liberal too. But it's just they've kind of gone in different directions, these players, and it speaks to that idea of there's just no unity in this movement or amongst these liberty-minded individuals.
The concern with having all ex-liberals joining the Lib Dems is then they become liberals light, which I know some people seem to think that's the thing, but they're supposed to be the Libertarian Party, which means some of their policies are going to swing the way I want them to swing versus some of the policies that go the other way. I think Kate's position, she summed herself up quite well when she was on the show talking about how she's economically right-wing but socially left-wing. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that if the Lib Dems get flooded with conservatives, then it's not going to stay a Libertarian Party for long.
Yeah. But someone like Mark Latham, I think, could have really bolstered things. And I think he is that kind of balance of economic right-wing or maybe not. He's quite a socialist now that I think about it. But he's definitely culturally conservative and trying to hang on to dear life to some of the tradition and sort of, to resist the onslaught of modernity and progressiveness that's coming our way. But yeah, Anyway, I might have to love you or leave you guys. I've got to head off. So thanks for having me.
Sure.
Thanks
All
for joining,
good.
Drew.
No worries. Awesome. Speak soon.
That's it. Well, I believe you had a question, centrist, about bills in Parliament. I've got a few questions written down I wanted to get through today.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to discuss that one first?
Yep. Okay. So for the listeners and for me, I would like to know. So if we get our chosen representatives to, so we're voting, for example, if you vote for the Greens, you vote for Lib Dems, you get them in the Senate or into the upper house. How does, like, who lodges bills to have things changed? And how does that get pushed through? Does it go through the House of Reps, and does anyone put a bill forward, or does it need to be signed off by different groups of people? How does someone go about getting change happening in the federal arena?
So you've got there's two types of bills. The first one being a government one, and that can be put forward by the Prime Minister, the Speaker. No. Actually, the Speaker might not be able to put bills forward. The Prime Minister and the other ministers, so the executive government, the cabinet can put forward bills and they get put through. Other than that, it's a private member's bill, which is what basically anyone who isn't the Prime Minister or another minister can put forward a private member's bill. These bills can be submitted in either house. Usually it's lower house, but it can be Senate. The exceptions to that is appropriation bills and taxation bills, which must start in the House of Reps. And then according to section, was it 50, 54, 55, 56? Sections 54, 55, 56 of the Constitution, those have to start in the lower house, and the Senate can only reject or accept those bills. They can't try to amend them. So when it comes to spending money, there has to be a lower house thing. But apart from that, either house can propose bills. Or usually it starts in the lower house, goes to the Senate, but it can start in the Senate and then go to the lower house, and then it's passed. So it can go the other way, but it's less likely.
So if we take a topic that spans all sides of politics at the moment as one of the things, and we run this through. So if, say, the legalisation of marijuana, you've got the Greens who are pro-legalisation, you've got a few of the other parties over there. There's actually a legalised weed party, the Lib Dems, etc. If a representative from those people are in the lower house, I said upper before, but lower house, then can they just table a bill in order to get legalisation put through and then have the vote on it? Is that how they would do it, or do they have to then get support from other groups in the thing before that bill can be put forward?
So all they have to do is just table the bill, and they do the first reading, which basically they read it the long title compared to the short title. Long title is like the long, so the act is there for the purpose of doing X, Y, Z, and then that's tabled, and then that's the first reading. So then that's voted on A or nay, and that's almost always accepted. And then it goes to second reading, which is which is when you have the amending the bill changes, and then that gets voted on. And then you have the third reading, which is the final read through, and that can then get amended again at that stage. But usually it's passed at the third reading. And then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate does the exact same thing, and then it's sent to the Governor General to sign. The problem is that the government obviously has more control over the bills getting through, because a lot of the bills are government bills. So minor parties and the opposition, it's usually, they're against the government, so they're already in the minority. So it's a lot harder for them to get bills put through than it is for the government to do it, unless the minor parties have the support of the government in the first place, which is, with Liberals and Labor, it's not likely either of them support legalising marijuana.
If Labor relies on Greens, then there's a chance that the Greens could put pressure on them. I'm just interested to see how, obviously you hear about in the States where they table a bill and it's like 400 pages long, but it seems a bit ridiculous. I was just wondering how we can then sort of leverage on if our representatives get voted in, how we can push them to try and table bills that they've obviously run on and like part of their policies and stuff. So it's just it's all right, interesting, cool.
Oh, our bills can be crazy long as well. So I've got here, Native Title Act, which I just pulled down from the shelf, is 600 pages long. So we still have long ones here as well. It's just the US has more crazy ones, but we still have long ones, and these are as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So do our politicians do the same, where they sneak stuff in that has nothing to do with the bill?
It's harder, but they can do that. Yes.
Okay. So that's and that'll happen when they put their amendments through, right? When they take the bill that's had its first reading.
Yeah. When you start amending it, or it'd be more likely that what they'll do is they'll add an amendment to the bill, and then that amendment can be taken another way to do something else. So it can have a meaning that relates to the topic of the bill, but it can also have a broader scope than the bill itself, and go into other areas of law.
Interesting.
Which is more likely, in my opinion, at least. So Drew wanted to discuss preferential voting, which we talked about before the show.
Yeah.
So I guess he's left, but I'll go through anyway because there's so many myths about it in Australia as to what exactly preferential voting is and how it's counted. So I've just done up a quick few slides that I'll go first. And if you have any questions, we'll set them as we go through. I've just got to try and look at how I share the slides again. It's been a while. There we go. There we go. So, of course, the first round is the first time to count the votes. So what happens in the first round basically is if any politicians, this is just House of Reps, I'll discuss the Senate afterwards. The House of Reps is easier to understand. So when you have the House of Reps seats, of course, if it's if there's two parties on the ballot, like Labor, Liberal, or Nationals, Labor, or whatever, then obviously it's pretty straightforward. But when you have three or more, and none of them gets the majority of the votes at the start, then you have to go through preferencing. So how that works is that I've just done a quick few slides. So in this discussion, we'll say candidate A 28 votes, candidate B 27, candidate C 24, and candidate D 21. So of course, candidate D has the least votes. They're taken out of the competition basically. And so all the people who voted number one for candidate D, whoever they voted number two for, then goes that candidate then gets their vote. So if four of candidate D's voters voted candidate C number two, then candidate C gets 4 votes. If 15 of candidate D's voters preferenced candidate B second, then those votes go to candidate B, and so on and so forth. So you end up then with 2 votes going to A, 15 to B, 4 to C. So that then gives you a total of 42 and 28. And of course, the result of that being the candidate C has the least votes at the end of that round. So they're then eliminated. So then you get to the final round, and after the preferences are being distributed again, you end up with candidate A having 28 and 2 already. So they already had that 30. And then 16 voters who voted for candidate C, their next preference was candidate A. And then same for candidate B. If 12 people preference candidate B, then their votes go to candidate B. And you end up having 46 and 54 votes. And then the result of that, of course, being the candidate B has the majority of the votes. So therefore, they win the seat. So that's how those votes are counted.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it also goes to explaining the thing you said at the moment where everyone's talking about how a party does preference dealing. Now, the party doesn't dictate where your vote goes. They can advise you where they would like to see it go. So if the Greens would preference Labor, for example, then they would say, look, this is how we want to see you fill out the card, which is 1 Greens, 2 Labor. But you don't have to do that. Everything is down to you. You can choose where your vote goes. So when the party says they preference someone, it doesn't mean that you have to actually give that person their vote. Your vote, sorry, not their vote.
Yes, I believe that myth comes from the upper house. So in the Senate, you got voting above the line and below the line. Above the line is voting for the party. Below the line, you vote for individual candidates. When you vote for the party above the line, the party controls who gets that vote. So they have a list of candidates. So we had Kate Fantanel, and she was the lead candidate. She was the lead Senate candidate for Lib Dems.
Mm-hmm.
They also have a number 2. So the quota, I believe, is this is just at a normal election, not double dissolution, where the quota is lower. At a normal election, the quota for the Senate is, I have it here somewhere, 14.3%. It's 7.7 for when all 12 seats are up for grabs in double dissolution election, but usually it's 14.3. So if, say, the Lib Dems got 15% of the vote, then Kate would get in. If they got 28.9 or whatever, that's 2 times the quota. Well, that's above 2 times the quota, so they both get in. That's based on what the party. So the party will say the first lot of votes go to Kate. When she gets in, the next lot of votes go to candidate 2, and then the candidate 3, and so on and so forth. But if you vote, it gets more complex compared to the House of Reps because you can also vote below the line and vote for individual candidates. So you might choose to vote for the number 2, but not the number 1 for that party. So then it gets more complex, and it's a lot harder to try and do preference votes for that. For example, South Australia had their election last month. They're still doing they're still counting preferences for the Senate or the upper house there because it's just so complex to count them. It gets crazy because you number. I think you number 1 to 12 for below the line if you vote in the Senate. And then to try and preference all of that, it gets crazy.
So ultimately, the only power a party has on your vote is if you vote above the line for the Senate, and then they have control of where your vote goes because you're giving your vote to that party. All right, cool.
As you said, they can do preference deals, but what that means is that I think the One Nation and Lib Dems are doing it, I'm pretty sure, is that Lib Dems will say to their voters, give us number 1 and then do One Nation number 2 because we like them better than the other party. So that way, if we don't get in, if we're eliminated, then our votes go to One Nation.
Yeah.
However, that's only a recommendation. The voters do not have to follow that. It's only the recommendation of the party. Voters can choose to vote UAP number 2 if they want, or anyone they want to vote number 2. They don't have to vote One Nation number 2. That's just what the party would prefer you vote for.
All right. So above the line on the Senate, I still dictate where it goes for number 2, though. So if the Lib Dems, if I vote, and I'm just using Lib Dems 1 and then Greens 2, after the Lib Dems, if they get eliminated in those Senate holdings, then my vote goes to the Greens.
Yes, because you voted for it. So the only time the party can control your preferences, the party only controls it for voting above the line for the political party itself. So if the Greens have 3 Senate candidates and you vote them number 2 and your first option won't get in and you vote above the line in the Senate, then your preference will go to the first candidate.
Okay. Yep. That's very simple.
That's the only way the party can control who you vote for and where the preferences go. It's complex, but there's been that myth that the party controls that they don't control who the votes go to. That's entirely up to the voter.
That's what I thought.
The next question I had a few from that I did a Instagram story poll and got a few questions from that. We had one question that said, does the Northern Territory have senators, and if so, how do they work compared to the state ones? Because that's different to the US, for example, where the territories there don't get any say at all really in the elections. So the territories have 2 each. I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, centrist. I'm pretty sure they have 2 each, and then 2 each for the territories, and then they only have 3-year terms as opposed to 6.
On a side note, why is it still the Northern Territory? Why isn't it become a state?
So it was originally South Australia, and then in 1911, I think, they gave that land to the federal government. Yeah, part of that was because to create a state that could, protect or create an area that could help protect the Aboriginal population, because that's the state where they're the biggest is Northern, or the area where they're biggest is the Northern Territory, and so that was given to the federal government. It wasn't made a state because the government likes to keep control of everything that it can. So as a territory, the federal government can legislate on its behalf. So they can pass laws that apply to Northern Territory, but they can also give Northern Territory power to write laws themselves. But because it's not a state, the federal government can override any law passed by the Northern Territory government because it's technically part of the Commonwealth rather than being a separate state. Same for the ACT. They didn't get self-government, though, till the end of the last century. I think the 1970s, they didn't get self-government till then. And they still don't have complete autonomy. Of course, only having two senators versus 12 is a sign of that they're not considered to be equal to the states in that sense, because the idea of the Senate is to represent the state's interests.
Yeah, that's a bit, I don't know how I feel about that. I think I'd rather see them as a state and give the people of the Northern Territory a bit more of a say. But
and of course, they also only have like a couple of members. I think they've only got like 2 or 3 in the House of Reps as well. It's a very, very small because of their population. Like all of regional Northern Territory is one federal electorate. Like all the regional areas of that state are just lumped together as one electorate, which isn't the most fair. But on the other hand, if it's done by population, so it's not fair to the state. But if it's done by population, then it's fair compared to the other states. But it's not fair to the Northern Territory itself to only give that whole area just the one seat. So it's a balancing act, really. Looking at the people of the territory versus making it fair for everyone else. You can't give them special treatment because they're a territory, not a state. The idea is that states are more equal than the territories are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Cool.
And the last question I had is, I'll just try and pull it up on my phone. It was a question about the Prime Minister. There we go. Who is really in charge, the Prime Minister or the Governor General?
Prime Minister.
That's a hard one.
Technically, the
Governor
General can do whatever he wants, but
technically,
yeah. But it's definitely the Prime Minister has more power at the moment. I think the Governor General is sort of a sit-back role and just unless something gets really, really out of hand, I don't think he really wants to get involved. So.
It's always the Governor General always acts on the advice of the ministers and the Prime Minister, but advice in this sense means instructions rather than advice. The only exception is John Kerr and Gough Whitlam, where John Kerr, the Governor General, dismissed Gough Whitlam, the Labor Prime Minister, and appointed Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister, and then had Fraser call an election. That's the only time that the Governor General has broken convention. Was to get rid of Gough Whitlam, and that's a whole. I got to talk about that for an hour. It's just such an interesting discussion because then you talk about was the CIA involved and everything like that. It's very complex to discuss what exactly happened there because it proves that the Governor General can, in practice, actually exercise more power than they can.
Yeah, well, technically,
they can exercise that power. They just choose usually not to do it. But they can.
The same sort of discussion comes around the Queen, because obviously we're still part of the Commonwealth, so the Queen could technically pull some rank and use the Governor General to do what she wants, but it's just a figurehead stuff at the moment. It's not really. That's why there's always a debate every few years about whether we should become a republic or not, and give ourselves take away that sort of any possibility. But it is what it is.
Well, yeah, the Governor General usually gives assent to bills that, in some cases, that's left for the Queen, not the Governor General, but the Queen can actually override the Governor General within 1 year. So that's Section 59 of the Constitution. The Queen can override the Governor General within 1 year of the Governor General giving assent to a bill. Again, the Governor General can also choose to not assent to a bill, but again, doesn't do that because it goes against convention, basically a figurehead. But the Governor General. So in the same sense that they can, dismiss the Prime Minister, the Governor General, in theory, it hasn't been tested yet, can dismiss the Governor General because the Prime Minister advises the Queen on who to make Governor General. So in theory, the Prime Minister can write to the Queen and say, sack the Governor General. So in theory, they can. We just haven't seen it done in practice yet, so we don't know how that will play out. But the debate around the Governor General and the Prime Minister is always when it's like, in theory, versus in practice, and then there's the exception, which is the Gough Whitlam one. It's crazy.
It's a big club and we ain't in it, right? That's the one.
Yeah, it's one of the few things I like about the US system is they don't have that, who's really in charge discussion. Who isn't really running the country is the president, whereas we don't have that certainty over here. And you're right, it's a big thing for the Republican movement is the fact that, we have that divide between Governor General and Prime Minister to work out who really is the head of state. Other than that, if you didn't have any other questions, I think we'll wrap it up there. We've passed the hour mark.
Yep. No, I'm good. That was good. So.
No worries. Just, I guess the last announcement is join us tomorrow. We are having Rob McMullen on, our UAP candidate for Griffith in Brisbane. So I'll be asking him about his thoughts on the Greens being in Brisbane and then that statement that they made, that Adam Bent made. So that's at the same time. So that'll be tomorrow, 10 a.m. AEST and 8 p.m. US EDT. Other than that, guys, we'll see you then.
Gotcha.